Following is a conversation with Stefano Carpani, a Neo-Jungian analyst, and we get into what Neo-Jungian means in this episode, talking about Stefano's model of the Jungian world with the original Jungians, the Post-Jungians, and now the Neo-Jungians. So really interesting, kind of looking at the 5 generations of Jungians. And yeah, we also look at his map over between Jungian thought and sociology, because he originally trained in sociology. So really interesting to map over that external collective element of the human psyche with the internal individual. So that was really interesting. We look at his I model, and we also talk about the bleeding through of the unconscious at pivotal moments in history. So Stefano wrote an article about the Berlin Wall. So we kind of get into that sort of memetic infection of our daily life. Really interesting chat. Probably could have gone on for a lot longer, but yeah, very interesting. Hope you enjoy it. Stefano, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, you're a very international man. You're an Italian man practicing in Berlin, but also teaching. You do some teaching in Pacifica and in Essex, or you're connected to both of those institutes, is that right?
I graduated from Essex. I have a PhD from Essex, but currently I have no relationship with that institution. I am a graduate, member, and lecturer at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute Zürich, where I would say I belong. And I am also responsible for a graduate certificate at Pacifica in contemporary analytical psychology and neo-Jungian studies. Basically, what I did for them was to put together the best, the most important, the most well-known, the most influential Jungians and have them teaching online to people. This year, 25-26 is the 3rd season, and we have, again, full house, sold out. So it's amazing to see how many people are interested in the work of Carl Gustav Jung and analytical psychology and what I call neo-Jungian studies, that is even going farther, post-Jungian studies.
So I guess that's what I'm very curious to talk to you about. It was Eric Goodwin that recommended you, and then I just went off kind of digging around, being like, oh, who is Stefano Carpani? And there's a wealth of material out there. You've written a few books. Breakfast at Kusnacht is the one that jumped out at me because you've interviewed so many oh, there we go. Breakfast at Kusnacht, published in 2020, I think, or was it 20? Which is just conversations with many Jungians from across the world, I guess. And yeah, it seems like you have a great point of view for, and I think you've specifically developed this of being able to do an analysis of the Jungian world, or having a sense of the creating a map of the Jungian world. I am just finishing this book, which is Andrew Samuel's Jung and the Post-Jungians. You mentioned the term Neo-Jungian there, so can you give us a sense for what these terms are? Is there a difference between Neo-Jungian and Post-Jungian and Jungians? Are they all around now, or what's the story?
Well, we are all Jungians, as I believe that all Jungians are also Freudians, but it's something nobody says.
That's interesting.
We all come from that. And then there are distinctions. We are all Jungian, for sure, which means we all come from Kusnacht, from the work of Carl Gustav Jung, and the first generation of Jungians, that is just a few names: von Franz, Yolanda Jacobi, Barbara Hanna, Neumann. But perhaps Neumann was the first post-Jungian, right? Because he's the one that, although under the umbrella of analytical psychology, started to look at things in a different way. And the very good thing is that anyone that went away from orthodoxy is still a Jungian, while we know that everybody that went away from Freud was kicked out. 2 names are, for example, Jung himself, Adler, and later also Ferenczi. But what was important for me when I, even before writing this book or transcribing this book, because this book was born out of YouTube interviews that I started recording in 2017. What I wanted to do was to bring the Jungians to a wider world. Jung and analytical psychology is niche. It's also a bit pop. Jung is much more pop than Freud. For example, Jung's face is on the face of Sgt. Pepper's cover from the Beatles, not Freud, which means he was more pop. But I believe that today, analytical psychology, the original insights from Jung, might help understand what is happening around us. This is why I started interviewing Jungians from all around the world, asking them three basic questions. Who is Jung? Who is your own Jung? And what is the relevance of analytical psychology today? And then I dive deeper into their specificalities. So what was their contemporary work? This is why this book came out, and it was quite revolutionary. It's not me saying this, but it was a momentum in 2020 when people started looking at the fact that someone under 50, like me, or actually 42, 43, could publish a book that is not only selling a lot, but is also bringing Jung in a new fashion. There are very few Jungians, actually none, I would say today, that broke the threshold of the clinical and the popular. There are writers, there are filmmakers, there are artists, but I bet you cannot name a Jungian, a trained psychoanalyst, that made it through the threshold of pop culture, or that is well known because writes a column on a newspaper, that is a well-known, for example, commentator or columnist. And this is a pity. I truly believe that Jungians, post-Jungian, neo-Jungians, we must have a little bit more of courage and help people, society with our tools. For example, I just wrote a book with my partner, Ludmila Osterman, titled War is Reset. Can we talk about war? Can we analyze war in the 21st century? Yes. Clinically, beyond clinically, and I truly believe that the tools that we have at our disposal can really help understand better what is happening around us, why the world is out of joint. Now, to go to your question, because I didn't answer your question.
And there's so many threads within that I could follow. But
I know,
I'm
but
grateful.
let's answer your question. So Andrew Samuels is my, as the German would say, doctoral father, so PhD supervisor. I love him. He loves me. I hate him. He hates me. We have such a strong relationship of mentor-mentoree. Nowadays, we even laugh who is the mentor and who is the mentoree. But our relationship is very strong, intellectually, from an Eros point of view. I owe him a lot. He wrote a book, I believe in 85, that was very important, and he's a trickster, so he openly say he borrowed or stole this book from someone else that wrote a book, The Post-Freudian. But that book didn't become famous. This book became famous because it was a time when von Franz was still alive. She died in 89. Hillman was coming up, but Hillman was not Hillman yet. And there was a need to differentiate between Jung and the first generation, so his children, those that studied with him, and those that are Andrew's generation. Andrew Samuels, Verena Kast, John Beebe, Paula Young-Eisendrath. Because, Mary Stein told me a couple of months ago, I'm working on an anthology of the post-Jungian, so the first anthology of the post-Jungian that hopefully will be published in 2026. Mary Stein, another legend in analytical psychology, told me, there was a time when I was in analysis with someone very close to Jung, but when this person didn't have an answer, would say, well, let me go back to Dr. Jung for the answer. So there is Jung and the very early Jungians. Then there are the post-Jungians. And the post-Jungians, Andrew Samuels underlines, are those that started to differentiate from Jung or from the dark side of Jung and analytical psychology. For example, without going into details, the concept of anima and animus are a bit contradictory today because are biased by gender. So they tried to work on that, also to clean Jung from the claim or the accusation that he was a Nazi or close to Nazism, that he was misunderstood, and other themes. This is very much what the Post-Jungian did. Basically revise analytical psychology, clean Jung of certain aspects that have to be adjusted. I believe my generation, the Neo-Jungians, don't have this duty. Actually, let me tell you who I believe the Neo-Jungians are. I wrote it in my book. I call those who use this new approach Neo-Jungians. This is an heterogeneous, international, multicultural group of scholars who, on the one hand, base their work on the teachings of Jung and of the Post-Jungians, while on the other hand, have opened their investigation beyond analytical psychology. Therefore, the Neo-Jungians are able to balance the teachings of Jung and the Post-Jungian with those teachings coming from other schools and tradition, both within and beyond psychoanalysis, which is very important. In a mutual, plural, enriching exchange, in fact, contemporary Neo-Jungians can be linked, although not limited, to relational and post-relational psychoanalysis, feminist psychoanalysis, the intersubjective approach, psychosocial studies, cultural studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies. So, I truly believe that, first of all, we have to read Jung. We cannot start from Hillman, for example. We cannot start from Samuels. We have to start from Jung. Then we have to start from the inner circle of the 20th century, and then move to Andrew Samuels, Gigerich, Verena Kast, etc., etc., etc.
So I have some thoughts on this, but I suppose before, because I've been thinking about that as in comparison to mature science, I guess I'm thinking about the work of Thomas Kuhn. But before I dig into that, I guess I just want to draw that out. So you're saying that yours is a sort of a temporal genealogy. So we've got the Jungians as the first generation, and then the Post-Jungians as the ones that came after, and the Neo-Jungians. And
can I make it even more complicated? Because actually what you just said, or what I said, is 3 generations. But actually there are 5. Because there is a generation that is like a Matratzen generation, or in between the Jungians and the Post-Jungians, like Hillman himself, Lopez Pedraza, even Neumann perhaps, and another one between the Post-Jungian and the Neo-Jungians, Mark Saban, Susan Rowland, Roderick Main, someone that is in between the 2 spheres.
Kind of straddles, doesn't fit neatly into either category, but you can kind of see as a hybrid. So I wonder how you'd square that with Samuels in 1980s writing that book, and he has the division between classical Jungians, developmental Jungians, and then I forget what he calls Hillman and
archetypal Jungians.
So do you still see those trends mapping out within the different generations?
It was correct of him, but we could say that the classical Jungians are the first generation, and then both the developmental and the archetypal are post-Jungians.
Mm-hmm. And I can see how
because the developmental are really those coming from the London school. Actually, it was even something different. Originally, you would say the Zurich school, so those in Zurich, and the London school. Because actually the London Institute, SIP, School of Analytical Psychology, opened in 1947, while the Jung Institute in Zurich opened in 1948. Really? So it was, at the beginning, it was really the Zurich people, the London people, and then the Americans. But then Andrew realized
when did Pacifica come on the scene, or was New York
much later,
Pacifica,
much later in the 80s with Hillman, Stephen Eisendrath, who's a good friend of mine, and the archetypal school. But Pacifica is under the archetypal school. I would say these are traditions, yeah. But if you want to really cut through generation, is a bit different, because then, of course, you have the developmental Jungians, but now you have the relational Jungians, but they are still post-Jungians or even Neo-Jungians, right?
So you'd still have that generational thing. Yeah, okay. So that's
But at
interesting.
the
So
end
we've
of
got
the
like
day, I would also say, who cares? This is just
I love a good map, and I think it does, like, having a good map of the territory does help you, and I think that's something Samuels does really well, is building, giving you a map for, like, hey, here's the Jungian world, here's the psychoanalytic world, because he does a lot of covering the overlaps with the psychoanalytical and seeing where they touch points. And I found that very helpful for, like, contextualizing it within the overall thing, because yeah, I think other than Robert Moore talks about Kahoot a good bit, but like other than that, there's limited like cross pollination as I've come across it within the stuff that I've read in Jung, and I guess it's probably because I read some of the more classical writers. So that, like, I found that really helpful, and I think that there is a lot of value in, which I guess this is a good way to bring me on to the point of, like, you mentioned we start with Jung, and then maybe we go on to Neumann, and we go on to von Franz, and then you've got your Hillman and Gigerich. It's an awful lot of reading, which is fine, but I feel, yeah, the impression I got, and I've been thinking about this the last couple of months, with regard to Kuhn, is the idea of the textbook. And I've been reading a lot of economics this year, and I'm trying to think, is it Samuelson is the guy who wrote this textbook in economics, and it was used for more or less 20 years, just revising the editions, and the textbook gives you a sense of what the tradition is now. There might be a chapter at the start, we'll say in a physics textbook, here's a chapter on the history of the field. We don't need to go back and read Newton, we don't need to read the Principia. We've got that, and now we're covering theory, and here's what you need to be within the paradigm. I feel like having to go back and read, 20 volumes of Jung, or whatever, 18 volumes of Jung, and then having to read, Neumann, like, Origins and History of Consciousness isn't a short book, and then you're getting into the updating the science, and then there's so much, which is why Samuel's work, I think, probably was so resonant, is because it's a sense of, like, okay, here's what we can kind of discard to some extent, and to some extent the map maker gets to decide what the territory is, because you say, hey, this is wrong, and then that makes it into the canonical thing. And so I feel like there's a value. I've been thinking, and maybe there already is, or there already are textbooks out there, but I just wonder, something that gives that solid base around which the field can kind of gather at a certain point in time. So, because I think genuinely, in creating a paradigm, that sort of canonical text and that canonical map of the territory is very useful, and that's where I think there's a lot of value in what you've done in saying, hey, we can gather the tradition in this, or the history of it in this way. We can see the generations, and then we've got these traditions within the generations, and I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think
true.
Maybe sell it a little bit short.
I don't know. No, I don't disagree with you, but we have to distinguish between why do you read Jung, the Jungians? If it's for fun, for your own nourishment, is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you decide to train, well, it's a bit different. There are steps that have to be accomplished. What I really like, actually, at the Jung Institute in Zürich is that there is not a program. There is not year 1, 2, and 3. There are 2 steps, which is before you give exams and pass the propedeuticum, which means you go to classes, you have theory, but you can choose the classes you can go to. You can choose the exam you can give in a certain order. So, for example, fairy tales, individuation, ethnology, developmental psychology. So you make your own plan within a certain cluster of subjects. And then when you give the exam and pass the propedeuticum, it means you can also start working with patients. And so everything changes. But again, you build up your own program. Many people are happy with that. Many people need a more contemporary university style, that this is more Pacifica. But if you want to train to become a clinician, you have to read certain stuff, which is at the core of Jungian studies. Otherwise, it gets diluted, it gets translated, and it gets lost. What is important, and this is only psychoanalysis, you don't have this in philosophy. Yeah, you have a little bit in philosophy, but you don't become a clinician. You don't have this in sociology. When you decide to become a psychoanalyst, you have to choose which kind of school to train at. And because it's not the same. We can do it very simple. Freudian, Jungian, Adlerian, even Kleinian, yeah? And you cannot start from a Jungian school then switch to Freudian. You have to start again. So basically, it means also learning a language. And this brings us to a shadow side of analytical psychology, and perhaps this is why we are not able to cross that threshold and speak to the people, because we have a very difficult language. Freudian languages enter the common parlor, but the Jungian language, apart from complexes, extroverted and introverted, which is very typical words from
I would say shadow is also
shadow, but for example, anima and animus, transcendent function, and so on.
individuation to
Individuation is now more or less very confused with individualism or the sociological individualization, but Jungian talk weirdly. Jungians don't talk for non-Jungians. But when I write for a newspaper, I have to write for everyone. I have my partner always says, your books are very specific, but when you write for the newspaper, it's so understandable and clear. And this is what the Jungian should become aware. Otherwise, we talk to each other.
Yeah, I think that's maybe an identity crisis within the field, because obviously within academic journals, you want to speak in the nomenclature of the field. You want to use the technical jargon because that's how you're building up the edifice of the language, and that's how you're getting deeper into new theoretical ground rather than rehashing the same old thing. So obviously that's reserved for that. But yeah, when it comes to the popular speaking, then of course you need to be starting from basics, because otherwise people aren't going to understand the language. But that's in scientific fields, that's the work of popularizers. And I think there's a strange thing with the Jungian of like, is there a rich enough academic field just for that, or is there kind of a, because the thing is the clinical element comes in as well, where it's you're speaking to embodied life, you're speaking to real problems, and so there is a sort of a confusion even in the, we'll say when people are putting out Jungian books, there's still a personal element, so it feels more embodied than a technical scientific book. But it's not quite yet. It's still jargon heavy, and it's still very much reading through the lens of a certain theoretical framework.
But look, if you look at Memory, Dreams and Reflection, that was not written by Jung, but he wrote a chapter, and then Aniela Jaffe really wrote it. It's so clear. That's why is the ultimate bestseller in all his portfolio of work. Understandable, down to earth, speaks to the reader. And when somebody comes with a dream, you can analyze and interpret that dream without using a difficult jargon. Of course, you can use anima, animus, CG, persona, but you can also make it accessible.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I find the theoretical concepts actually can hinder that, because you kind of get caught at this intellectual level. You're playing an intellectual game with concepts rather than actually interacting with the dream. And
but then if you play that way, you lose all the eros. It becomes unauthentic, and basically it becomes sterile.
100%. Yeah,
I had honor and pleasure to work in supervision with many of the legendary post-Jungians. No one makes it difficult. No one uses difficult jargon.
Yeah.
It's something that
I'm not against the use of, or I'm not against the having of the theoretical framework, and I agree that you don't need to be jargon heavy, but I do think you need the theoretical framework. You just don't need to always talk in the terminology, you know? But I also, I guess for me, I'm like, have we advanced since the field, is the field too caught up on its founding father? is it still too...
I don't think so. I believe there was a time where when the founding father was treated like a messiah, like a deity, and Andrew was very good. Andrew and many post-Jungian were very good in dismantle this. Now is a global discipline, because especially in the past 20 years, IAP, the International Association for Analytical Psychology, developed and is supporting the development and training of candidates basically everywhere. So it's becoming also less white, because psychoanalysis is still very, very white, very expensive, not only to receive it, but to train, very elite. So this is something that should be looked at. There is Jung, and Jung, for many, is a kind of grandfather or great-grandfather. You said it, I started with Andrew Samuels, possibly because that book spoke to you. So when I read Jung, when I read certain Jungians, sound like they speak to me. They answer to a problem I have, and it's comforting. I also had other kind of analysis or therapy, and it didn't work, because it was a matter not of the language we speak, but of the language of the soul. So, as James Hollis would say, to become a Jungian, you have to be someone in exile who feels in exile, as Jung himself felt, as von Franz herself felt. So you have to come from the humanities. You cannot come straight from medical school. So the study of literature, of myth, of what was before is very, very important. I studied literature and philosophy, then sociology, and then I finally decided to train when I was 35, but I wanted to become a psychoanalyst when I was 17. Of course, as the son of bipolar depressive mother, that was my way, my fantasy of survival, right? But I didn't have the tools, because I was the first one in my family ever to go to university, and to think of becoming a medical doctor was too big. And in fact, I didn't study medicine. So coming from exile is quite an interesting point of view, I would say, for Jungians.
Yeah, and there's actually, so you've brought up an interesting avenue there. Your background is in sociology, and you've done that work, I guess, of bridging Jung into other disciplines, and you've kind of talked about this as the Neo-Jungian way, as bridging not just psychoanalysis, but bridging beyond that into the fields beyond. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, as a teenager, I was in love with poetry. When I went to university, more than poetry was, of course, literature. And at the end of my BA, I would say, I got closer and closer to sociology. So especially the work of Anthony Giddens, Zygmunt Bauman, and I wanted to study with them. So I applied both at the LSE, where Giddens had become director, and then Cambridge, where John Thompson was. And I did an MPhil at Cambridge with John Thompson, and I worked on the concept of individualization. Individualization, that is a concept coming from Ulrich Beck, German sociologist Ulrich Beck. Basically, is describing current society, or the society between really the 70s and the early 2000s, which is a detraditionalized society. Those authors, Giddens, Beck, Bauman, believe that we are in a second modernity or late modernity, means we live in a detraditionalized society where every individual in the West, not around the globe, in the West is able to take decision. So homo optionis. In the modern society, you were born in England, you would stay in England, you would do the same job of your father if you're a boy, or your mother if you're a girl. And if you were working class, you would stay working class. But they say that in the contemporary world, or the second or late modern world, actually, you could be born in England and then challenge your nationality, your gender, your profession, your religion, your marital status. Homo optionis means create your own biography. It's a risk society, because if you live under the tradition, nothing is risky. It's well known. And so according to the sociologist, we are free. We are free from the chains of tradition. But then I ask myself, but why is depression rates, anxiety rates, suicidal rates increasing? Are we really free? And even if we have reached freedom, which other freedom are we looking for? And this is what I wrote in my book, Absolute Freedom, is if we live in an individualized society, we need individuation. So really to become ourselves. And here is where Jung steps in. In fact, after my MPhil at Cambridge, I had to leave academia for 10 years. I was very depressed and drained. And I understand that I didn't go on with my PhD at the time because I was missing something. And possibly it was missing the unconscious, missing Jung. So I put together sociology and Jungian psychoanalysis to say society is developing in a certain way, but we also need the soul. We need to understand the contents of the soul. This is what I call the I, individuation in an individualized society, or absolute freedom. It's not enough the freedom that those sociologists claim. We are now even in a post-liquid society, right? In a super society made of algorithm and such a speed that is crazy to survive. So maybe we just have to slow down. But we cannot control that. But what we can look at is the contents that our unconscious bring us on a daily basis. On a daily basis, about relationship, about jobs, about family. So is also against the anesthetization of society, right? We are always connected, and it seems that there is no space to cultivate the soul in the super society.
Interesting. So the soul is a key element there in the unconscious. I wonder what does it look like for the unconscious to bring that into the everyday? You mean dreams,
Well,
analysis?
look,
What does that mean?
in this book, in Absolute Freedom, I write about patient. And actually, I want to write another book that is called Love Does Not Exist When It Is a Projection. But in this book, I talk about a patient. She came to me because she felt empty, stuck, and that sentimental relationship do not last. So, analyzing 70 dreams, we can see the complexes that come up. And complexes for Jung are the via regia to not the unconscious, as Jung would say, but really to your life, to the psyche. Freud used to say dreams are the via regia to the unconscious. Jung used to say complexes are the via regia to the unconscious. Dreams are the via regia to the complexes. So what these complexes are telling us, okay, my partner could have a father complex, abuse complex. But why is she telling me I feel empty? Well, many people in the late second modern society feel empty, although she accomplished sociologically. She moved from her original nation to another one. She chose the job she wanted to choose, although her parents wanted her to study economics. She married, divorced, remarried, and we could go on, but she feels empty. And at night she has dreams, or she has nightmares. The content of her dreams tell us clearly the way she might want to take. They suggest the solution to the problem or to the reason why she came into analysis. This is what I say, I plus I. We are individualized in the late second modern society, but we must become individuated, which for Jung means to listen to the Vox Dei, that voice of the inner wise man or woman that we have.
So taking that kind of a depth approach, I guess, to the problems that we're living through in the 21st century?
Any problem. This is why in the book War as Reset, I look at war, at the meaning of war, or other current issues. Even in a previous book, Lockdown Therapy, why we went through COVID and what COVID could teach us. How can we analyze COVID at that time through the lenses of analytical psychology?
And how can we?
Well, why we had to stop? Because of COVID. Our life was suspended. So even our certainties of the bourgeois life of the early 20th century were suspended, right? So perhaps that could be an opportunity to reflect about what's going on. Hyperspeed, no depth, and perhaps the chance to slow down to understand what are really the important things in life. Expectations versus longings, who we really are. And perhaps if we are able to slow down, we might find that life, authentic life, is very different than the one we perform every day. Ulrich Beck, French author, said, life will be the same after COVID, actually will be worse. He was right. After COVID, war came. Fight against nations that were friends. It resembles so much the beginning of the 20th century, when the European nations were friends, where the borders didn't make sense, and then war erupted. Jung wrote an amazing paper, actually two, Wotan and After the Catastrophe, and he wrote, before 1914, the civilized nation believed that war was a thing that we would never experience again. And then suddenly, one day after the other, we were at war with each other. And we didn't even know why.
Which is quite similar to Francis Fukuyama's We Live at the End of History thesis from the early 90s, once the Berlin Wall collapses and once the Cold War ended. It was like, hey, we've found out that capitalist democracy is the pinnacle of history and nothing will ever change from here. This is the way.
Well, but it was terribly wrong. As he admitted in 2018, he said, liberal democracy will spread everywhere. The truth is that something else spread everywhere, which is the tension. So it was a very arrogant statement from an American saying that we know how it should be. And to be frank, also what happened is that at State of the Union on the September 11th, 1989, George Bush father said, we want a world that is not divided. We want a world where relationship can be bilateral. We can be equal to our friends and former enemies. And then in 1991, he invaded Iraq. And then the Twin Towers terrorist attack happened. And then there was invasion of Afghanistan. So we have to be very careful to what people do, politicians do, and actually at the symbols that the unconscious give us.
What an interesting add-on at the end. I get the part of being scrutinizing politicians, but what do you mean and the things that the unconscious gives us in the context of that sociological, geopolitical
Let me give you another example from a paper I wrote almost 10 years ago, and it's titled The Fall of the Berlin Wall as a Numinous Event. The numinous is a very important Jungian concept that brings opposite and is actually what helps the development of society. Historians have studied the fall of the Berlin Wall from an historical point of view, but not from a psychological point of view. And what we know is that in the month before the fall of the Berlin Wall, dozens, hundreds, thousands of people were marching in different cities of the DDR, from Dresden to Leipzig and then Berlin. And of course, it was a time of perestroika and glasnost, so Gorbachev was less interested in saving Eastern Germany or any Eastern European countries from revolution or from changes. But it's also historically proven that people in the DDR didn't want capitalism, wanted a change.
Is DDR East?
DDR
East Germany?
is Eastern Germany. Yeah, Eastern Germany. In fact, the old Politburo president Honecker was destituted, was brought down. Krenz in early '89 came on power, but basically was new face, younger face, same old shit. So people didn't believe this change, and that's why they were demonstrating on the streets. And it was really a peaceful and bigger movement that was not repressed as it was repressed in the past. So there was a new wind, but it was not enough. So every day the new government, the Krenz government, was holding press conferences announcing changes. And one day, the 9th of November 1989, Gunther Schabowski, who was an experienced and seasoned communist politician, press officer, so the one that was used to give daily press conference to talk about what was going on, went on stage for 1 hour and started detailing all the press conference, all the new changes. One was to allow Eastern Germans to travel to West Germany or anywhere else in the world without going through the long and tedious visa request. Because in the old times, the communist regime would believe that if you ask to go to West Germany or somewhere else, you don't like to live in Germany. You don't even like, you go to visit your friends, but you come back and it's not okay. That was the best place you could be. So it was very impossible, and thousands of Germans were doing their best to escape, and many died. That's why the Berlin Wall was created in 1961. Well, that night, I believe that when Gunther Schabowski was talking about this new law, so allowing Eastern Germans to travel to West Germany or the world without having to ask for these visa and permission, made him fall into a trance. From the video you watch, you see he was a politician in himself, and at some point he received a question that is, from when is this happening? From when Eastern German can go west? In that moment, I believe the power of the collective unconscious is taking him. These millions of people marching in Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig and being louder and louder. But their voices were not the problem. It's the collective unconscious that basically infected him. And he lost his professional communist politician press conference guy attitude. He looked at the paper. There was a white paper, as if he was finding for an answer. And the only thing that came up, when we just say one word and we don't know where it comes from, he said, sofort, immediately. So immediately means that very moment people could go to the checkpoints and leave without having a paper. As you go from England to Ireland, or I go to France and Italy. So you had thousands of people at the checkpoints wanted to go west. What happened? The border police was scared, didn't know what to do. They were ready to shoot, as in the usual past, as in Prague, as in Budapest. But the order to shoot them never came. The order open and let them go actually arrived. And this is how I believe truly the Berlin Wall came down, not only because of the daily pressure and demonstration of the people, but also because this man was infected by the collective unconscious. And he said this word that changed history forever.
Okay, so you think that was a moment where the collective unconscious came through?
And
as in he was possessed, or...
Excuse me?
As in there was a sort of an archetypal possession that happened, or like his consciousness was overwhelmed? Or what
no, it's not about archetype here. It's more what Jung's call meeting of the conscious and unconscious, when he came into a trance. For that period of time, he lost his politician persona, and he was infected by the collective unconscious. So what he said was not coming from a man who is aware what he's doing is basically when we drink a glass of wine too much and we are not so in contact with ourselves. We might say or do things that we wouldn't do when we are 100% in control of us.
So the bottle of wine example, I can understand. I'm fascinated by this idea of the collective unconscious as having something there, or of like, okay, if his persona comes down, that he's, you use the word infected, very, very interesting language, and I guess it brings to mind the Dawkinsian idea of the meme as this sort of, which I think there's good overlap, or there's a fertile room for overlap with Jungian archetypal theory when it comes to that concept. But it seems like the idea of being caught by a sort of memetic infection, that there's something, his mind has caught something there, and connecting that with the collective unconscious, that's a very interesting, like, because so that's a depth perspective that you don't see in a normal sociological analysis, which is going to come more from, you know, looking at the historical precedent or some kind of historical dialectic leading up to that moment, the contradictions and something. So I love that, and it's appealing as a depth perspective. I wonder, do you have other examples that come to mind of that, or yeah, because it's one example, and I can see what you mean. I don't know the press conference. I must go look at it and see if I can see what you mean. But it's the language you're using there is quite novel. I don't hear this much, and yet it overlaps with ways I have of thinking by pulling things in from different domains. Do you have you thought more about that? Have you seen other senses of this infection, of this bleeding through of something else?
Well, Jung's talk about that in certain times, in certain epochs, there are individuals that get, I would say, infected, but that become transition makers, people that shift the epoch. One could be Rosa Parks. One could also be Nelson Mandela. And we can go back in history. Usually artists are these, true artists.
I mean, I can also think of Jung's, was it 1936 essay on Wotan, or maybe it was after the war he wrote the essay where he talked about the blonde beast in the German psyche, and it being the ancient Germanic god Wotan as, I guess, infecting the German psyche.
Yeah, but that side would be more, when an archetype, for example, Jung was misunderstood when he came to Berlin to talk about the positive and the negative side of the swastika, and what I'm referring is those men and women that basically become the bearer of a message or the unlocker of a situation that otherwise would be stuck. Jung talks about the artist as someone who is able to unconsciously grasp the collective unconscious and create a piece of art, whatever this is. And when the artist is able to bring this into art and give it to the collectivity, well, these become common knowledge. So that tension is gone. And there can be development. I see Schabowski, although he was not an artist, this kind of person, the unlocker of a situation that was stuck. The question would be, why, for example, this didn't happen in Northern Ireland. This didn't happen in Budapest 56. This didn't happen in Prague in the 70s, when the abusive regime had thousands of people demonstrated against it, but there was no Schabowski there. Perhaps time was not right. Perhaps there was too much will alone, but not eros. So things had to work even more before that a change could happen. I really love the romantic idea of Nelson Mandela, who he was considered as a terrorist. That's why he was jailed. And he was able to survive almost 20 years in jail until things changed, and he became the president of a free nation. So from terrorist to hero. it's quite a strange world, the one we live in, right? One that is a terrorist, and then he becomes an example, not only because he won the Nobel Prize, but example of how to change regimes and to tear apart apartheid. I truly believe that beyond history, sociology, politics, there is an important psychological component that we should look at and that might help us to understand why certain things happen. Even in contemporary politics, why is there now a retrograde that is bringing us back to very hardcore right-wing experiences, which are not very much about sitting down and discussing things, but are top-down. I think also Jung and analytical psychology help us to understand this. First, because of the concept of enantiodromia, so we live in opposites, and that cannot be only development, but also Jung would say, and this is the reason why he says we had World War I and World War II, that we live in an age that is lacking of spirituality, authenticity, depth, and possibly we live really in an age of hypocrisy where it's very difficult to stick to the truth because the power of the bullies is too strong.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of different threads I could pull out there. I guess I want to go back to the infection thing, because I'm not sure that they're different. I'm not sure that. So actually, I would take two different lenses. I'm not sure that I believe that this German politician was imbued with collective unconscious or Rosa Parks, or yeah, I guess I find the power of sociology. Like, you're asking why didn't it happen in Prague, why didn't it happen in all these other places at all these other times, and I think you can look at that as, yeah, you say the time isn't right. I think it's that there are certain conditions for an infection. If your body, if you're very healthy and you're only exposed to a small dose of the virus or the bacteria, then your body can handle it. You know what I mean? And you're well slept, you're well rested, you're well fed, then your body's able to handle it. But as those break down, the conditions for infection increase. And you listed out earlier the reasons why that infection at that time in East Germany, in Berlin, were at a peak, was because, Gorbachev was like, yeah, we got enough shit to deal with over here. We're not going to, and also wanting to move away from the entire clamping down. Whereas in the 1970s,
maybe I can help you bringing
case.
in the concept of the shadow. So if you are in your persona, you're very conscious of certain things you are. But if you are not conscious of your persona, you don't know that something in you is also its opposite. So basically, Schabrowski, being infected by the collective unconscious, by the wishes to change East Germany, basically became his shadow. And that word, sofort, immediately, is not coming from his mind, from his persona, but from his shadow.
Yeah, okay, so it's the bleeding through of something, but obviously the memetic, or the meme infection, the collective unconscious infection, had spread massively at that point, and there was the sense of, like, people had belief that you talked about the expectation that was coming to arise there, like it was
Maybe
almost like
instead
a
of infection, you can use contamination, spread. In fact, if you look, it started with few dozen of people in Dresden, then hundred of people, then Leipzig, and then it came to Berlin. And then it was unstoppable, like the COVID, right? It started with one person, then another, then it was unstoppable. So what analytical psychology says is that you cannot stop the power of the unconscious.
Which is where I would connect it back over with Germany in the interwar period, that I think it's the same thing, that infection, that spread happened, that it's not so very different. Because you could even look at Wagner as the artistic presage of that in the 1870s,
it's
1880s.
a bit more complicated, because in those times there was also, before World War I, we could also look at it psychologically with the fact that William II was the king and he wanted to become the emperor of all the Germans. So not only of the Prussians, but also the Austrians. So create the big Germanic state. But of course, Franz Joseph from Austria was not happy, but he was very, very old. So he didn't have the libido really to go against this. And at the same time, there was the threat of the communists coming from the the Soviet Union. And a court, both in Germany and in Austria, was often said that it's better to go at war than to let the communists come and rape our wives and transform our state. There is something else very interesting of Wilhelm II. He had a very strong inferiority complex against his grandpa, William I, that made Germany, that actually made Prussia with Otto von Bismarck. And there is another anecdote that I think is very important and Adlerian. He not only had an inferiority complex toward his grandpa, but he also had a physical inferiority because I believe he suffered of polio, so he had a shorter arm. And he compensated this inferiority or this situation with his fantasy, megalomanic fantasy of becoming the greatest king and emperor of all times of the Germans. This led to World War I. And then the inter-warriors were very much about humiliation and the compensation of this humiliation. This is why Hitler came up. Again, unfortunately, Hitler was another unlocker of something, as you said, archetypal and unconscious. But this is exactly what Wotan is.
Yeah, I guess like I could see Wilhelm II, that feeding into it, and then Hitler, and then of course the Wall Street crash. I see them all as, or Hitler as, yeah, a galvanizer, something like a catalyst, and maybe this fits in. I'm thinking out loud, thinking about where Rosa Parks and where the East German
Rosa Parks was another unlocker.
Was.
When that night she stood up and decided to see where was forbidden, with her action she unlocked something, and the world was changed forever.
Mm. And you could look at the same with George Floyd. That there's like moments that I guess create. Yeah, they just focus the energy. They're like lenses through which all of this history is kind of flowing, and then it's focused, and then
they're not conscious of
forest fire catches.
And they're not conscious of it. I wouldn't go as far as George Floyd, but for sure, Rosa Parks and Gunther Schabowski.
But I don't think Rosa Parks is like, I am the vessel of history. I think she's just a woman going about her day, and she's just doing her day. Like, she's a woman who's had enough that day. You know what I mean? And it's like a build up of something. I don't think that. I don't know. I don't see her as of these figures.
I don't know if she thought I have enough, but there is something that is changing history forever. And this, Jung would say, could be the numinous. So something that possesses you and brings awe and its opposite, revelation and its opposite, but also fear, hunger, because it's open. It's not one-sided. It's not toward a clear end. So it's really an opening.
Mm. But I really think that this is where, like, if you get into the how does enantiodromia work? Like, if we're looking at, well, let's peel under that, and rather than like looking, oh wow, it's popped up over there, like it's somehow transmuted into its opposite. It's trying to analyze that part in between, trying to catch that reversal of the energy.
But let's be aware to not confuse terms, because one thing is the numinous, one thing is enantiodromia. Enantiodromia means opposite. Enantiodromia means if you have day, you have night. If you have light, you have darkness. And if you are aware of those, it's fine. If you're not aware, the opposite side will take the space.
But Jung talks about it, so like if you go to Heraclitus, he talks about it like the way up and the way down are one and the same. Like in Heraclitus, there's a sort of the connection of the opposites, but in Jung, he talks about, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but enantiodromia as the movement, how one thing reverts to its opposite when it goes too far one direction. It's a psychological dynamic, whereas in Heraclitus, it is more of a Yeah, a raw. He's creating a metaphysics.
I follow you. It's how this manifests. For example, Jung says, if you are too conscious, enantiodromia would manifest through unconscious contents. Okay, if you are too much in your conscious persona or into your unconscious persona, so it's something that also helps to bring back equilibrium between what you are consciously and what you are unconsciously, or what you are conscious of and what you are unconscious of.
Which is where I would situate these different historical tide changes. And the George Floyd one has been, I think, the COVID lockdowns exposing a level, again, like increasing giving the right fertile conditions for this sort of a catching fire to happen, because the normal dampening factors are gone. The same thing happened in East Germany with the Berlin Wall, and the same thing with Rosa Parks. There's a build-up of energy, and Marx and Hegel would talk about this in terms of the dialectic. The contradictions of the dialectic emerging of that stage of history, and then you're seeing the reversal. And I think that's even what's happening with the populist right now. Is that the reason why populism has grown so much is because partly you can look at through a sociological lens, the way algorithms work. They're feeding towards the most polarizing emotions, the most powerful emotions of anger, outrage, fear, and so it's there. You can look at sociological lens.
I would say simply ignorance and fear. That's why I call war is a reset. Is a reset of a lost word. Populists are afraid to lose what they already lost, and it comes from the past.
Yeah, but I think the reason why populism has been constellated is because of this dramatic shift to the left since 2011 through kind of coming into a peak in 2016. I think that combined with so like look at it from sociologically, you can see the algorithmic dynamics of like, hey, here's the base, the movements in the base that are happening that is causing this to happen, and then you look at it through this lens and you can see that actually the build-up of that resentment comes from 2011 on. We could go into depth about the psychology of that, but I think that there's those sociological elements come in, but there's this enantiodromatic movement happening because things go so far culturally left very quickly in a way that they hadn't. And like you can look at Obama being good friends with Bush, being good friends with the Clintons. There's a very like linear line of camaraderie, or like even though they're opposite sides, they're still very close together. There's a moderate nature of that politics, but then by the time it gets to 2011 onwards, you're seeing this ramping up to the algorithmic dynamics, releasing this outrage, fueling these massive bonfires of emotion on either side and creating this polarization, and then that vying for the culture, and this hyper moral left, and then this kind of shadow enantiodromiatic that comes along. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And I think that
a left that has no plans, no programs, friends of bankers, and they lost touch with the people. That's the true problem of the left, I would say. For me, to make it even simpler, right? We're talking about trying to talk with easy words. The left, since the end of the Berlin Wall, has lost the identity, but all the Labour Party in the UK, the Italian Labour Party, the French one, there was a big one, even the Democrats have lost the ability to deliver because they were never in government before, actually. And they don't have an enemy anymore. The Italian Communist Party was the most powerful and biggest communist party on the West side, and is one of the worst right now. And because it's easy to be a shadow government, but when you have to go up and sit on the government stage or seat, you have to deliver. You cannot just talk about values and about Marx and about even the third way. Giddens was the closest advisor to Tony Blair. He even became Lord because of that. Actually, Andrew Samuels and Tony Giddens were both advisors to Tony Blair. And I always say that the difficulty was to let Tony Blair understand what the souls of a nation or of an individual speak. A sociologist will always be more understandable. And we just had an example, right? I was trying to express my idea about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's very complicated. It is untangible. How a prime minister would believe a Jungian psychoanalyst that looks things from a very independent and weird way.
Yeah, I suspect we could converse about this for many hours. There's a very fertile ground here, and maybe we'll revisit it at some point in the future. But I really appreciate your time, Stefano.
Thank you.
And yeah, really enjoyed this. A lot of interesting insights and a good sense of the Jungian map today.
Thank you.
So I really appreciate that. Before we wrap up, a couple of questions. First of all, is there anyone you'd like to amplify? Is there any thinker out there you think you'd love for my audience to hear and to learn more from?
Thank you. There are many colleagues, but I think one name is Elana Lach, Israeli art therapist, Jungian activist, fantastic. In the US, you have Naomi Azriel and Brooke Laufer. In Italy, you have Elisabetta Iberni. In Brazil, you have colleagues. In China, I will stop here. There are so many colleagues that you could talk to.
Brilliant. There's 2 or 3 very good names there. I'll follow up on. And last question: anything you'd like to plug? So we've looked at Breakfast at Kunacht. There was Absolute Freedom, and I'm trying to think of the third book that was there. Is there any books in particular, or
maybe
I'll link your
like
YouTube channel as well with your interviews?
I would like to talk about my initiative that is called Jungianeum, Initiative for Contemporary Analytical Psychology and Neo-Jungian Studies. Is a cluster of initiatives. It is a monthly meeting called Psychosocial Wednesday, where we invite a Jungian to talk about their work, and then we have a Q&A. It is a publishing house republishing books that are that you cannot find them, and we publish them and we sell them for a very decent price compared to the academic publishing. It is also a biennale, so a conference every 2 years. We held the first one in May called Psychoanalysis on the Couch. So many initiatives that try to spread analytical psychology in the 21st century.
Brilliant.
And they are all pro bono. So
and are the question and answer events or the talks, are they in person or are they also virtual? Are they recorded?
No, they're virtual, because otherwise it would be very expensive to organize them. They are usually the central Wednesday of each month and free of charge.
Brilliant. And this will all be found on the website that we'll link below, or is there
on Instagram, on Jungianeum, or on Facebook. It's called Psychosocial Wednesday, or my own Facebook and Instagram.
Brilliant. I will link some of those down in the description. Thank you so much for your time. And hopefully chat again at some point.
I'm sure we will do it. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.